Hello and welcome to Occult Book Review. This week's book is Star.Ships by Gordon White. I've already said in articles and in previous blog posts that I believe this is the most important occult book of the 21st century so far. I don't believe everything in it should be applied to everyone else. So from that particular perspective, I hope to talk about it from an Irish context. There have already been plenty of reviews of Star.Ships, and I don't really want to repeat everything that people have said, but I have to give a short description at least about what Gordon White tries to do. And it's a hugely ambitious book. He talks about taking Western magic and trying to find its roots going back much further than Alexandria. But it's much more than that. It's an anthropological mystery. It's also a book about the roots of astronomy, astrology, and mythology. And he quotes various authors. And what's important for me anyway, he quotes a lot of recent work as opposed to going back to the 19th century first archaeologists and anthropologists who became aware of mythological motifs being similar around the world. He uses quite a lot of research. If anyone attended my lectures last year about Irish stone circles, they'll know about the origin map, which Gordon talks about. He also talks about shamanic wisdom in the pyramid text by Nadler, which again is a book that I've spoken about in relation to Newgrange. Talks about the Dogon people, Serious Mystery, Robert Temple. I personally found Temple's Netherworld a much more useful book, and a book which has more in common with Star.Ships, but this is also worth checking out. There's a huge section about Gobekli Tepe, and Laird Scranton's recent book, Point of Origin, is interesting in terms of the etymology. The word Tepe, for example, has very obvious connotations when you think of Zep Tepe. The first time, Tepe and Tepi are interchangeable. It doesn't matter what the Turkish Republic now tell you. It was a phonetic description long before it was a written one. Potbelly tail is one way of translating it, the Tepe, but the Tepi can be the first place, which ties into ancestors, obviously. The book is also about magic, so grimoires is essential to get further insights into that. And also at the end of the book, which I'll talk about, the work of John Anthony West and Robert Schoch comes to the fore again when it comes to White's own particular perspectives. And he does say in quite a few podcasts that this is a map and it may change, so it shouldn't be mistaken for everyone else's territory. And that's what I find objectionable in terms of the podcast hosts and also reviewers who are applying everything that Gordon White says is a personal interpretation to a world map. I don't believe that to be accurate, and I don't think it's helpful either. Star.Ships is a history of people, it's a history of culture, but it's also a history of story, and it's a history of religion. And to that end, the book begins with the knowledge we have today about migratory patterns out of Africa and up into Europe, turning right and onward into Asia and Australia, and eventually into South America, of course. So he talks about the work of Dr. Michael Witzel, the origins of the world's mythologies, and the premise is to show that certain figures in spiritual traditions tend to repeat themselves and are tied to stars. And he then goes into kind of an exploration of various star lores, ideas that show that the way we see the physical world today is not the way that ancient people saw the physical world. And when I say ancient people, we're talking going all the way back to to that migratory pattern out of Africa. And as at one point he talks about the Sand people and the idea of the trickster god being 70,000 years old at least. The huge depth of these timelines is very interesting in relation to current findings. Genevieve von Petzinger is quoted in the book, and her work as well. And at one point White talks about the idea that the length of time where a certain set of 32 symbols has been used is 40,000 years old, and he says that there's no trend towards complexity, which basically means that when we found these symbols they were complete as they were, so they must have originated somewhere else. I suppose for me, looking at that from an Irish perspective, it's funny the way these things coalesce and synchronicities tend to appear. The history of Irish DNA has changed quite a bit. Only in 2015, scientists at Trinity College and in Queen's University in Belfast showed that the first Irish people were from the Fertile Crescent region and not from some Aryan invasion as posited by people like Kuno Meyer and Mercy Eliade. People don't know, of course, Eliade and Meyer have since been found out to be quite racist in their ideas. Meyer famously losing his freemanship of Dublin when he went to America and began to lecture on German nationalism and the superiority of the Aryan race. I think the same things have been found out by Eliade, which means that we need to take their work with not a pinch of salt, but we need to look at it again completely. So White asks us to recontextualize a lot of the information we may have taken for granted. And again, if I'm looking at that from an Irish perspective, then I look at the work of Maria Gamboutas and her Kurgan hypothesis, and that ties in nicely to von Petzinger's ideas, at least as far as I can see. The whole idea of a matriarchal culture bringing this proto-language to Europe seems to work out quite well when we look at the relationship between the Hathor cults of Nabta Playa, which also moved over to Kut el Hayuk and eventually up into Egypt. So why should we even care about the difference between matriarchal cultures and the way they saw our place in the universe and patriarchal cultures? I suppose to put it really simply, I can best do that in the words of John Lundwall, who said that matriarchal cultures mythologize history, whereas patriarchal cultures historicize myth. So the difference there is plain to see when you compare the paganism and the Abrahamic faiths. It's quite plain to see what happens to societies when that occurs. Bringing it back to Ireland then. Well, White talks about Göbekli Tepe quite a lot in the book. And he talks about Klaus Schmidt. He talks about the idea of it being a star temple on a hill. Now, bear in mind, there's only been 5% of Göbekli Tepe excavated so far, but there seems to be quite good evidence that people didn't live there, unless we're going to find something very unexpected when we keep excavating. But there are relationships to the kind of Osiris and Isis type couple, and this brings us back to Newgrange. But there's also the idea of excarnation and people being taken away into the sky by the vulture. The vulture is the symbol of Isis, but the vulture was also one of the first symbols for Cygnus. Cygnus today is most people associate it with the swan. Cygnus is obviously associated with Newgrange, not just because the passageway reflects the body of the swan, but the Cygnus constellation itself. White also talks about how there are much more flood stories and myths coming from the Asian and Pacific regions than there are in Africa, for example, and how these stories moved up into Europe. And he gives various reasons as to why flood myths may have come about. This ties into the work of Dr. Marion Dowd and Dr. Ruth Carden last year, which showed that Irish people were in Ireland 2,500 years earlier than previously thought. Now, if you think about that, what that means is every book about Irish roots and origins before last year is wrong, and it has a relationship to the idea of the Clovis people in America and how that idea is being abandoned now because, as White talks about, these people also moved from the Pacific Islands up into South America much earlier than previously thought. So we can see why a lot of the mythological motifs have a strong resemblance to each other. Of course, they carry their own cultural differences, which appear later on as people see different animals in different geographical regions, they see the stars in different positions, and so on. And all of this provides the basis for White's ideas then with respect to spirituality and our probable interaction with spirits going back, thousands and thousands of years, which kind of ties into his reinterpretation of the Western magical tradition. And that also gives us another avenue into the function at Göbekli Tepe. I've written about my own views before. I think it was as likely to be a place of birth as it was a place of typical ceremony. We know that ancient European matriarchal cultures were run by shamanic women who were associated with birth, and this process was as much a spiritual process as a physical. And these women would supposedly draw down spirits from the stars into bodies. So I think that ties in well with Göbekli Tepe. Even today, the vibratory function, potential function at Göbekli Tepe, with the stones vibrating when hit, can have parallels with drum circles when women in indigenous cultures are giving birth. The idea of there being bones found shows that there was nourishment needed, and of course beer, using the first cultivation of wheat for beer as opposed to bread, would tie in with potential pain alleviation. That they're my speculations, they're not White's. White has different ideas. But with only 5% of Göbekli Tepe excavated, it's fair to say that we may change our opinions when we find more. White talks about the Saraswati River. He talks about the origins of Isis and Osiris, as I've already mentioned. He talks about Sumerian magic, Egyptian magic, and he talks about the debate about the age of Egyptian monuments. He shows that the way traditional archaeologists and Egyptologists think about Egyptian construction techniques is most likely wrong. And he also talks about the shamanic function, which I think Nadler has shown to be true anyway, of the kind of the Hepsed ritual and the reason why various temples were built, and why pyramids probably have a much more shamanic function than is currently accepted by mainstream historians. We then get White's views as to why we should look at the Western magical tradition in a different way. White looks at what Crowley thought at the time and how things have changed. We get a breakdown of kind of the Yazidi cosmology. We get so much in the book, it's impossible to talk about it all here, but I'm just trying to present this review in some kind of coherent fashion. We get a breakdown of folklore and why a lot of what we thought were fairy encounters and UFO encounters may be the same thing and be something other. They may be spiritual interactions. For me, it's the one part of the book that I kind of was disappointed with. In 2013, Vallee and Chris Aubeck retracted some of the stories in Wonders in the Sky. In fact, the whole book is going to be redone again, and some of those anecdotes are used in Star.Ships, which, I think there are stronger stories out there, but that's just a small thing. So Star.Ships, I can't recommend enough. As I said at the start of the review, this is a review which focuses on some changes in how Irish history is being perceived. So hopefully that doesn't put people off. There's a lot more to be said. You could actually do a whole series on this book, but I recommend Star.Ships highly. As I said, it's probably the most important occult book of the 21st century so far. Star.Ships by Gordon White, by Scarlet Imprint.